The sound of incoming mortar echoed across the desert compound as Captain Sarah Mitchell watched her C-130 Hercules explode into flames on the tarmac. 3 weeks of planning, countless hours of preparation, and now their primary transport lay twisted and burning under the relentless Afghan sun. The medical supplies, ammunition, and food rations that could keep forward operating Base Phoenix alive for another month were nothing but smoke and debris scattered across the runway. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Standing 30 feet away, untouched by the destruction, sat their backup aircraft. It was older, battle-scarred, and according to every flight manual ever written, should have been retired years ago. But it was flyable, and in a war zone where hope came measured in fuel capacity and cargo weight, flyable was all that mattered. What made this moment extraordinary wasn't the explosion or the desperate situation. It was the fact that the only person qualified to fly that backup aircraft was someone every commanding officer in the region had written off as incapable. Someone they'd relegated to ground duties because of outdated assumptions about gender, capability, and what it meant to be a combat pilot. The morning had started like any other at Kandahar Airfield, with the oppressive heat already building before dawn and the distant sound of helicopters, preparing for another day of operations. Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez had been awake since 0400 hours, reviewing cargo manifests in the dimly lit operations center while the rest of the base still slept. At 26, she had developed the habit of arriving early to every assignment, a defense mechanism learned from years of having to prove herself twice as hard as her male counterparts. The manifest for today's supply run to Forward Operating Base Phoenix was standard by military logistics standards, but critical by survival metrics. Medical supplies including blood products and antibiotics, ammunition for the soldiers holding the remote outpost, and enough food to sustain the garrison for another month. The base had been cut off from ground resupply convoys for 3 weeks due to increased insurgent activity along the main supply routes, making this aerial delivery their lifeline. Elena had been assigned to the mission as a cargo loadmaster, a position that involved calculating weight distributions, securing equipment, and ensuring that everything arrived intact. It was important work, but it wasn't flying. She hadn't touched aircraft controls in 18 months, not since the incident that had effectively ended her pilot training and relegated her to ground support roles. The morning briefing took place in a concrete-walled room that smelled of stale coffee and jet fuel. Major Robert Coleman, the mission commander, stood at the front of the room with the confidence of someone who had flown dozens of similar missions. He was a competent pilot with a solid record, but Elena had noticed something in his recent flight reports that concerned her. His approaches had become increasingly conservative, his decision-making more cautious, and his tolerance for risk had diminished noticeably over the past few months. Next to Coleman stood Captain James Patterson, the co-pilot, fresh from stateside training with the enthusiasm of someone who had never been shot at. His flight suit was still creased from the supply depot, and his aviator sunglasses hung from his collar with the precision of someone who had practiced the gesture in a mirror. Elena had seen his type before, technically proficient, but lacking the instinctive feel for aircraft that separated good pilots from great ones. The third crew member was Technical Sergeant Marcus Thompson, a veteran loadmaster with 15 years of experience and the weathered hands to prove it. He had worked with Elena on previous missions and was one of the few people who treated her with the respect her knowledge deserved rather than the condescension her rank seemed to invite from others. "All right, people," Coleman began, his voice carrying the authority of command, but lacking the edge that came from recent combat experience. "Standard supply run to Phoenix. Weather is good, route is clear, and intelligence reports minimal enemy activity along our flight path. We should be wheels up in 2 hours and back in time for lunch. Elena shifted in her seat, her attention drawn to the intelligence briefing packet that lay open on the table beside her. She had studied it extensively during her early morning. Preparation and what she had found troubled her. The reported minimal enemy activity was based on intelligence that was 3 days old, and the communication intercepts she had reviewed suggested a significant increase in insurgent movement in the region surrounding Phoenix. But questioning intelligence assessments wasn't part of a loadmaster's job description, and Elena had learned through painful experience that offering unsolicited opinions about mission planning was a fast way to earn a reputation as difficult to work with. She had made that mistake once before, and it had cost her everything she had worked for. Rodriguez, Coleman continued, his tone shifting to the dismissive cadence he reserved for support personnel. You'll be responsible for the standard cargo checks. Make sure everything is properly secured and accounted for. We can't afford to have medical supplies shifting around during flight or ammunition breaking loose during landing. Yes, sir, Elena replied, her voice neutral despite the familiar sting of being treated as if she had never seen the inside of an aircraft before. What Coleman didn't know, what her current assignment carefully omitted, was that she had more flight hours in C-130s than Patterson, and nearly as many as Coleman himself. The briefing continued with weather reports, communication frequencies, and the standard safety reminders that preceded every military flight. Elena listened with half her attention while the other half focused on the tactical situation reports she had memorized earlier. The pattern of insurgent activity around Phoenix suggested something more organized than the random harassment that had been disrupting ground convoys. There was a coordination to the attacks that implied advanced planning and detailed intelligence about American operations. As the briefing concluded and the crew prepared to move to the aircraft, Elena approached Thompson with a question that had been troubling her since she first reviewed the mission parameters. Marcus, have you looked at the weight distribution calculations for this load? She asked quietly, her voice pitched low enough to avoid drawing attention from the officers. Thompson glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard, then leaned closer. What are you thinking? The medical supplies are all loaded in the forward section, and the ammunition is concentrated in the rear. That puts our center of gravity almost at the aft limit when we're fully loaded. If we hit turbulence or have to make any aggressive maneuvers, we could have stability issues. Thompson's expression grew thoughtful. He had worked with enough pilots to recognize when someone was thinking beyond their assigned responsibilities. You've been doing this calculation in your head. It's just something I noticed, Elena said, deflecting the implicit question about her background. Maybe we could suggest redistributing some of the weight. Coleman's not going to want to hear cargo suggestions from a loadmaster, Thompson replied, his tone sympathetic but realistic. You know how he is about chain of command. Elena nodded, understanding the politics even if she disagreed with them. In the military, knowledge without authority was often worse than useless because it created expectations that couldn't be fulfilled. She had learned to keep her observations to herself unless directly asked, a habit that had kept her out of trouble but hadn't done anything to advance her career. The walk to the aircraft took them across the sprawling expanse of Kandahar Airfield, past rows of helicopters, fighter jets, and transport planes that represented the massive logistical effort required to sustain military operations in Afghanistan. Elena had made this walk hundreds of times, but she never stopped noticing the details that others took for granted. The sound of engines warming up, the smell of JP-8 fuel mixing with desert dust, the way heat waves rose from the tarmac in shimmering columns that distorted the horizon. Their assigned aircraft, tail number 043142, sat in the cargo loading area like a gray whale beached on a sea of concrete. The C-130 Hercules was not a beautiful aircraft by conventional standards, but Elena had always found something compelling about its utilitarian design. Every line and surface served a purpose, from the high-mounted wings that provided ground clearance for the massive propellers to the rear cargo ramp that could accommodate everything from Humvees to pallets of supplies. This particular aircraft had seen better days. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The paint was faded and chipped from countless missions, and Elena could see patches and repairs that spoke of minor battle damage repaired in the field. But the engines looked solid. The control surfaces moved smoothly during the pre-flight inspection, and the hydraulic systems showed no signs of leaks or wear. "She's not pretty, but she's reliable," Thompson commented, following Elena's gaze as she examined the aircraft's condition. "Reliability is more important than appearance," Elena replied, running her hand along the aircraft's fuselage with the familiarity of someone who had performed this gesture countless times before. The metal was warm from the sun but solid beneath her palm, and she could feel the subtle vibrations that indicated the aircraft was ready for flight. The cargo loading process began with military precision. Each pallet was weighed, measured, and positioned according to the load plan that Elena had calculated and recalculated during her early morning preparation. The medical supplies went in first, secured with cargo nets and tie-down straps that could withstand the stresses of flight and landing. The ammunition came next, each crate clearly marked with its contents and handling requirements. Elena supervised every aspect of the loading process, checking and double-checking that each item was properly secured and that the weight distribution matched her calculations. It was meticulous work that required both technical knowledge and practical experience. But it was also work that kept her connected to the aircraft and the mission in a way that purely administrative roles couldn't provide. Patterson appeared at the cargo ramp as the loading neared completion, his flight suit now showing the first signs of the day's heat. He watched Elena work with the kind of casual attention that suggested he was killing time rather than genuinely interested in the process. "You seem to know your way around cargo operations," he observed, his tone carrying the faint condescension of someone making conversation with support staff. "I've had some experience," Elena replied, not wanting to elaborate on the nature of that experience. "Ever think about flight training? I mean, if you're interested in aviation and all that." The question hit Elena like a physical blow. Patterson had no way of knowing that she had not only thought about flight training but had completed it, excelled at it, and been within weeks of earning her pilot's wings when everything had been taken away from her. "I don't think that's really an option for someone in my position," she said carefully, her voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. "Never know," Patterson said with the casual optimism of someone who had never faced real barriers to his ambitions. "Things are changing in the military, maybe someday." Elena nodded politely, but inside she was remembering the day 18 months ago, when her commanding officer had called her into his office and explained that there had been concerns about her suitability for pilot training. The concerns had been vague, the explanations bureaucratic, and the decision final. She had been reassigned to logistics with the promise that it was temporary, that her training would resume once certain administrative issues were resolved. The administrative issues had never been resolved. Elena had spent months trying to understand what had gone wrong, filing appeals and requesting meetings with senior officers who either couldn't or wouldn't explain the decision. Eventually, she had stopped fighting and accepted her new role. But she had never stopped being a pilot in her heart. Coleman's voice echoed across the cargo bay as he completed his pre-flight inspection. "Looking good, people. Let's get this bird in the air." The crew took their positions as the engines began their startup sequence. Elena strapped herself into the cargo bay, surrounded by the supplies that would keep Phoenix operating for another month. Through the small windows, she could see the Kandahar flight line stretching into the distance, busy with the constant activity of aircraft taking off and landing. The K-130's engines reached full power with a sound that Elena felt in her bones. She had heard it thousands of times, but it never failed to stir something deep inside her. It was the sound of purpose, of mission, of aircraft and crew working together toward a common goal. As they taxied toward the runway, Elena closed her eyes and let herself imagine what it would feel like to be sitting in the cockpit instead of the cargo bay. She knew every switch, every gauge, every procedure required to fly this aircraft. She had demonstrated that knowledge in training, proven her capability in simulation, and earned the respect of her instructors. But knowledge without opportunity was just frustration, and opportunity without recognition was just a dream. Elena had learned to live with both, but she had never learned to accept them. The takeoff was smooth, the aircraft lifting into the Afghan sky with the steady power that made the C-130 one of the most reliable transport aircraft ever built. Elena felt the familiar sensation of gravity shifting as they climbed, the cargo settling into its restraints, and the aircraft finding its rhythm in the thin air above the desert. Coleman's voice crackled through the intercom with an update on their progress. 30 minutes to Phoenix, people. Weather is holding, and we're making good time. Elena acknowledged the transmission while mentally reviewing the approach procedures for Phoenix. The landing strip was shorter than ideal and surrounded by mountains that created challenging wind conditions, but it was manageable for an experienced crew. Coleman had landed there before, and Patterson had trained on similar airstrips during his preparation. What concerned Elena was the intelligence report she had studied that morning. The increased insurgent activity in the region suggested that their flight path might not be as secure as the briefing had indicated. Enemy forces had been targeting supply aircraft with increasing frequency, and the predictable nature of scheduled supply runs made them particularly vulnerable to attack. But intelligence assessment wasn't her job, and raising concerns about tactical situations was outside her authority. Elena had learned to trust that others were monitoring the bigger picture, while she focused on her assigned responsibilities. It was a difficult lesson for someone who had been trained to think strategically, but it was necessary for survival in a hierarchy that didn't welcome initiative from the ranks. The flight continued smoothly for the first hour, the aircraft tracking steadily toward Phoenix while Elena monitored the cargo and maintained communication with the cockpit. The medical supplies remained secure, the ammunition showed no signs of shifting, and the aircraft's performance indicated that Coleman and Patterson were managing the flight competently. Elena used the time to review her knowledge of Phoenix's tactical situation. The base was located in a valley surrounded by mountains, which provided some protection from ground attack, but also limited escape routes in case of emergency. The garrison consisted of approximately 200 soldiers, responsible for monitoring insurgent movement and coordinating with local tribal leaders. Recent intelligence reports had indicated increased Taliban activity in the region, but the threat level had been assessed as manageable by higher command. Elena had read enough intelligence summaries to know that manageable often meant acceptable risk rather than no risk, and that the distinction could be crucial in a combat environment. As they approached Phoenix, Elena moved to one of the cargo bay windows to observe the landing approach. The base appeared below them as a collection of concrete buildings and defensive positions carved into the desert landscape. It looked vulnerable. From the air, isolated and exposed in a way that emphasized its dependence on aerial resupply. Coleman's voice came through the intercom with approach information. Phoenix Tower, this is Cargo 77, requesting landing clearance. The Faenza. Response crackled with static and interference. Cargo 77, Phoenix Tower. You're cleared for landing, but be advised we've had some small arms fire in the area. Nothing direct, but stay alert. Elena felt her pulse quicken. Small arms fire meant enemy forces were operating close enough to the base to engage aircraft, which contradicted the intelligence assessment, that had described minimal enemy activity. Either the intelligence was wrong, or the situation had changed significantly since their departure from Kandahar. "Copy that, Phoenix," Coleman replied, his voice steady but carrying a new edge of alertness. "We'll make this quick." Elena watched through the window as the aircraft descended toward the landing strip. The approach looked normal, but she found herself analyzing every aspect of the flight path, every decision Coleman was making, every response the aircraft was giving to his inputs. It was an automatic process, the result of training that had been interrupted but never forgotten. The landing was smooth, the aircraft touching down on the short runway with the precision that came from experience and proper training. Elena felt the familiar deceleration as Coleman applied brakes and reversed thrust, bringing the massive aircraft to a stop well short of the runway's end. "Nice landing," Thompson commented, beginning to unbuckle his harness in preparation for the approaching for the Thompson Fathi. Susan commented, beginning to unbuckle his harness in preparation for the cargo unloading. Elena nodded agreement, but her attention was focused on the activity outside the aircraft. Ground crews were already approaching with forklifts and cargo handlers, but she also noticed that security teams were positioned around the perimeter with their weapons ready. The level of alertness suggested that the base was taking the threat of attack seriously. The cargo unloading began immediately, with Phoenix personnel working alongside Elena and Thompson to transfer the supplies from the aircraft to ground vehicles. The process was efficient, but hurried, with everyone aware that spending less time on the ground reduced their exposure to potential enemy fire. Elena supervised the unloading with the same attention to detail she had brought to the loading process, ensuring that each item was properly accounted for and that the aircraft's center of gravity remained within safe limits as the cargo was removed. It was technical work that required constant calculation and adjustment, but it was also work that kept her connected to the aircraft's performance and capabilities. As the last of the medical supplies was transferred to ground vehicles, Elena noticed a change in the activity around the base. Radio traffic had increased, and she could see soldiers moving to defensive positions with the urgency that suggested an imminent threat. The casual efficiency of the unloading operation was being replaced by the focused intensity of a unit preparing for combat. Thompson appeared at her shoulder, his expression serious. "You notice the change in atmosphere?" "Hard to miss," Elena replied, watching as more soldiers took positions around the aircraft. "Think we should suggest expediting the departure?" "Coleman's already thinking about it," Thompson said, gesturing toward the cockpit where the two pilots were engaged in animated discussion with Phoenix Ground Control. "Question is whether we can get everything unloaded before things get interesting." Elena looked at the remaining cargo, calculating the time required to complete the transfer against the increasing signs of threat preparation around the base. The ammunition was the most time-consuming to unload because of safety requirements and handling procedures, but it was also the most critical for the base's defense capabilities. "We need about 15 more minutes," she said, her mental calculation, accounting for the specialized handling required for the remaining items. "Let's hope we have 15 minutes," Thompson replied, his tone suggesting that he wasn't confident about the timeline. As if summoned by their conversation, Coleman appeared at the cargo ramp. His flight suit was now stained with sweat, and his expression carried the controlled tension of someone managing multiple sources of stress simultaneously. "How much longer?" he asked, his voice clipped with urgency. 15 minutes for the ammunition," Elena replied. "Maybe 12 if we skip some of the safety protocols." Coleman's jaw tightened. "We don't skip safety protocols. But we don't dawdle either. Get it done." Elena nodded and returned to supervising the unloading, but she found herself listening to the radio traffic and watching the base's defensive preparations with increasing concern. The signs all pointed to an imminent attack, and their aircraft would be a priority target for any enemy force that wanted to disrupt the base's operations. The next 10 minutes passed with increasing tension. Elena coordinated the ammunition transfer while monitoring the tactical situation around the base. The soldiers manning the defensive positions were alert and ready, their weapons trained on the approaches to the airfield. Radio communications had shifted to the terse, professional exchanges that indicated a unit preparing for combat. Elena had just finished securing the last of the ammunition when the first mortar round exploded near the runway. The sound was deafening, a sharp crack followed by the whistle of shrapnel through the air. Everyone on the flight line dropped to the ground, seeking cover behind aircraft and equipment. "Incoming!" Someone shouted, and Elena found herself pressed against the side of the C-130 as more mortar rounds began falling around the base. The attack had begun, and their aircraft was trapped on the ground in the middle of a combat zone. Elena's training kicked in automatically, her mind shifting from logistics coordinator to tactical thinker as she assessed their situation and began calculating options for survival. This was the moment when everything she had learned, everything she had trained for, and everything she had been denied would converge into a test that would define not just her career, but her life. The question wasn't whether she was qualified to handle the crisis that was about to unfold. The question was whether anyone would let her try. The mortar barrage continued for another 5 minutes, each explosion bringing the enemy fire closer to the aircraft and the personnel scrambling for cover around it. Elena remained pressed against the Ki-130's fuselage, her mind automatically calculating the trajectory and timing of the incoming rounds. This wasn't random harassment fire. It was a coordinated attack designed to disable the aircraft and trap it on the ground. When the barrage finally stopped, the sudden silence was almost more unsettling than the explosions had been. Elena raised her head cautiously, scanning the area around the aircraft for signs of damage or casualties. The runway was cratered in several places, and she could see smoke rising from hits near the base's fuel storage area. Coleman appeared from behind the aircraft's landing gear, his face grim as he surveyed the damage. "Everyone accounted for?" Thompson called out from his position near the cargo ramp. "All present, but we've got problems. Take a look at the runway." Elena followed Coleman's gaze to the landing strip, where several mortar rounds had created craters that would make takeoff extremely hazardous. The runway wasn't completely unusable, but it would require precise navigation to avoid the damaged sections, and there was no guarantee that the remaining surface could support the aircraft's weight during the acceleration required for takeoff. "Phoenix Base, this is Cargo 77, Coleman called into his radio. "We're going to need runway assessment and repair before we can attempt departure." The response crackled with static and bad news. "Cargo 77, Phoenix Base. Engineering assessment indicates runway damage is extensive. Repair time estimate is 6 to 8 hours minimum, and that's if we don't take more fire." Elena felt her stomach drop. 6 to 8 hours on the ground in a combat zone with enemy forces actively targeting the airfield was essentially a death sentence. Enemy mortar had found their range, and the next barrage would likely be more accurate and more sustained. "Request immediate medevac for our departure," Coleman continued, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Negative on medevac, Cargo 77. All helicopter assets are committed to ongoing operations. You're going to have to wait for runway repairs." Coleman's expression darkened as he absorbed the implications. They were stranded at Phoenix with no immediate prospect of departure, sitting on a damaged runway that enemy forces could target at will. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and the options for survival were becoming increasingly limited. Elena found herself studying the runway damage with the analytical eye of a pilot rather than a loadmaster. The craters were substantial, but they followed a pattern that suggested where the enemy observers were located and how they had calculated their fire missions. More importantly, she could see a path through the damage that might allow for takeoff, if the aircraft was handled with sufficient skill and precision. "Sir," she said quietly, approaching Coleman with the diffidence that her rank and position required, "I think there might be a way to get out of here." Coleman looked at her with the expression of someone who had forgotten she was present. "What are you talking about, Rodriguez? The runway damage. It's not random. Look at the pattern." Elena pointed to the craters, outlining the trajectory that enemy mortar had followed. They were targeting the center of the runway, but they missed the approach and departure ends. "If we could use a short field takeoff technique and navigate around the damaged sections." "That's pilot decision-making, Sergeant," Coleman interrupted, his tone carrying the familiar edge of someone being told something they didn't want to hear. "Leave the flying to the pilots." But Elena could see something in Coleman's eyes that troubled her. It wasn't just dismissal of her suggestion, it was fear. The kind of fear that came from being faced with a situation that exceeded one's capabilities and experience. Coleman was a competent pilot under normal circumstances, but this situation was far from normal. Patterson appeared from his inspection of the aircraft's exterior, his face pale but determined. "Aircraft looks good, sir. No shrapnel damage that I can see. We're ready to go whenever the runway is clear." Coleman nodded, but Elena could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his hands trembled slightly as he held his radio. The responsibility for getting his crew safely off the ground was weighing heavily on him, and the damaged runway represented a challenge that pushed the limits of his comfort zone. "Phoenix Base, this is Cargo 77, Coleman called again. "What's your best estimate for runway clearing operations?" "Cargo 77, we're looking at minimum 4 hours to clear the debris and fill the major craters. But that's assuming we don't take more incoming fire." 4 hours was an eternity in a combat zone with active enemy forces. Elena looked around the base's perimeter, noting the defensive positions and the alertness of the soldiers manning them. Phoenix was prepared for a sustained attack, but their aircraft was a sitting duck in the middle of the airfield. As if to emphasize the danger, the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar began again. This time, Elena threw herself behind the aircraft's main landing gear as explosions erupted around the runway. The enemy had adjusted their fire, and the rounds were landing closer to the aircraft with each salvo. When the barrage stopped, Elena emerged from cover to find that one of the new craters was less than 50 meters from their aircraft. The enemy was definitely targeting them specifically, and their accuracy was improving with each fire mission. "We need to get out of here," Patterson said, his voice tight with stress. "Sir, we need to attempt takeoff now, before they get our range." Coleman was staring at the newly created crater, his face pale with the realization that they were running out of time. "We can't take off from a damaged runway. It's too dangerous." "More dangerous than staying here and getting blown up?" Thompson asked, his practical nature cutting through the academic discussion of risk assessment. Elena studied the runway again, her pilot's eye calculating distances, obstacle clearances, and the performance characteristics required for a successful takeoff. The path she had identified earlier was still viable, but it would require precise flying and a willingness to accept risks that went beyond normal operating procedures. "Sir," she said carefully, "I think I can plot a course through the damage that would allow for takeoff." Coleman turned to her with irritation. "Rodriguez, you're a loadmaster. You don't plot takeoff courses." "I understand that, sir. But I have some experience with aircraft performance calculations, and I think—" "I don't want to hear what you think," Coleman snapped. "I want you to do your job and let me do mine." Elena bit back her response, but she could see that Coleman was struggling with the decision. His training told him that attempting takeoff from a damaged runway was unacceptably dangerous, but his survival instincts were telling him that staying on the ground was even more dangerous. The decision was made for all of them by the sound of small arms fire erupting from the base's perimeter. The enemy had moved closer during the mortar barrage, and ground assault troops were now engaging the base's defensive positions. Phoenix was under direct attack, and their aircraft was trapped in the middle of an active combat zone. "Sir, we need to go now," Patterson said urgently, "before they get close enough to use RPGs on us." Coleman looked at the runway, at his crew, and at the enemy fire that was growing closer by the minute. Elena could see the internal struggle playing out across his features as he weighed the risks of staying against the risks of attempting takeoff. "All right," he said finally. "Everyone back in the aircraft. We're going to attempt departure." Elena felt a surge of relief mixed with apprehension. Coleman was a skilled pilot, but she had seen enough of his recent performance to know that he might not have the confidence required for the kind of precision flying that would be necessary. The margin for error was essentially zero, and any mistake could result in the aircraft crashing on takeoff. As the crew prepared for departure, Elena found herself in the familiar position of knowing more than she was allowed to say. She had identified the path through the runway damage, calculated the performance requirements, and understood the risks involved. But her role was to secure the cargo and trust that the pilots would make the right decisions. The engines spooled up with their familiar whine, and Elena felt the aircraft begin to taxi toward the runway. Through the small windows, she could see muzzle flashes from the base's defensive positions and the smoke from continuing mortar impacts. Phoenix was fighting for its life, and their departure was as much about survival as it was about mission completion. As they reached the runway threshold, Elena heard Coleman's voice over the intercom, tight with stress and uncertainty. "Phoenix Tower, Cargo 77 requesting immediate takeoff clearance." "Cargo 77, cleared for takeoff. Godspeed." Elena braced herself as the aircraft began its takeoff roll, but she could feel immediately that something was wrong. Coleman was being too cautious, too conservative in his approach to the damaged runway. He was treating it like a normal takeoff when it required the kind of aggressive technique that pushed aircraft performance to its limits. The aircraft accelerated. Slowly, much slower than Elena knew was necessary for the short runway and the obstacles they needed to avoid. She could feel the hesitation in Coleman's inputs, the lack of confidence that was translating into inadequate performance. They were going to crash. Elena realized with crystal clarity that Coleman's cautiousness was going to get them all killed. The aircraft needed more aggressive handling, more precise navigation, and more confidence in its capabilities. It needed a pilot who understood that sometimes safety came from accepting risk rather than avoiding it. She unbuckled her harness and began moving toward the cockpit, knowing that what she was about to do would either save their lives or end her career. But her career was meaningless if she was dead, and her crew's lives were worth more than her rank or her position. The moment of truth was approaching, and Elena Rodriguez was about to discover whether her training, her instincts, and her courage were enough to overcome the barriers that had kept her from flying for 18 months. The aircraft was still accelerating, still struggling toward takeoff speed, and still running out of runway with each passing second. Time was running out, and Elena was the only one who could save them all. Elena reached the cockpit just as Coleman pulled back on the yoke, attempting to lift the aircraft off the damaged runway. The C-130 responded sluggishly, its wheels barely clearing the ground before settling back down with a jarring impact that sent vibrations through the entire airframe. They were running out of runway, and Coleman's conservative approach was failing spectacularly. "Sir, you need more power," Elena called out, her voice cutting through the cockpit noise. Coleman's head snapped around, his face flushed with stress and anger. "Get back to your station, Rodriguez, now." But Elena could see the airspeed indicator hovering dangerously close to stall speed, and the runway's end was approaching rapidly. They had perhaps 10 seconds before the aircraft would either achieve proper flying speed or run out of concrete entirely. The mathematics of flight were unforgiving, and Coleman's hesitation was about to kill them all. "Sir, with respect, you're not generating enough lift," Elena pressed, her training overriding her instinct for self-preservation. You need to rotate earlier and accept the higher angle of attack. Patterson looked between Coleman and Elena, his young face showing confusion and fear in equal measure. Sir, what are your orders? Coleman's hands were white-knuckled on the controls, his entire body rigid with the effort of trying to force the aircraft to perform beyond his comfort zone. Elena could see the conflict playing out in his expression, the knowledge that his current approach wasn't working warring with his unwillingness to accept advice from someone he considered unqualified. The aircraft hit another crater, this one deeper than the others, and the impact sent a shudder through the airframe that Elena felt in her bones. One of the main landing gear struts compressed fully, and for a terrifying moment, she thought they might lose the wheel entirely. But the gear held, and the aircraft bounced back into the air with enough force to give them a brief taste of what proper flight attitude should feel like. That's it, Elena said urgently. That's the angle you need to maintain. Sir, you need to hold that nose attitude and trust the aircraft to fly. Coleman's jaw clenched, but Elena could see something changing in his expression. The brief moment of proper flight had shown him what was possible, and his pilot's instincts were finally overriding his caution. He pulled back on the yoke again, this time with more authority, and the aircraft responded by climbing away from the runway with the steady power that Elena had been hoping for. But their troubles were far from over. As they gained altitude, Elena could see muzzle flashes from the mountains surrounding Phoenix Base. The enemy forces that had been targeting the runway were now turning their attention to the departing aircraft, and the distinctive crack of small arms fire began to echo through the cabin. Taking fire, Patterson reported, his voice tight with stress. Sir, we need to get out of their range. Coleman banked the aircraft to the left, trying to put distance between them and the enemy positions, but Elena could see that his flight path was taking them directly over known insurgent strongholds. The intelligence reports she had memorized that morning were proving their worth, and her tactical awareness was screaming warnings about the course they were flying. Sir, recommend heading 270, Elena called out, her voice steady. Despite the bullets that were pinging off the aircraft's hull, that course will take us away from the reported enemy concentrations. I know how to navigate, Coleman snapped back, but Elena could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He was flying by visual reference and basic map reading, but the terrain below was a maze of valleys and ridges that all looked similar from the air. Elena pulled out her tactical map, the one she had studied extensively during their flight to Phoenix. The enemy positions were marked based on intelligence reports and radio intercepts, and she had memorized their locations as part of her preparation for the mission. It was information that could save their lives, but only if Coleman was willing to listen. Sir, there's a surface-to-air missile site approximately 5 kilometers ahead of our current heading, she said, pointing to the map. Intelligence reported it as active as of yesterday morning. Coleman glanced at the map, his expression showing the first signs of genuine attention to her input. Are you sure about that location? Yes, sir. Grid coordinates 41, SMD 847,239, reported as SA-7, shoulder-fired missiles with an effective range of approximately 4 kilometers. Patterson looked up from his instruments, his face pale with the realization that they were flying directly into a missile engagement zone. Sir, maybe we should consider the alternate heading. Coleman's pride warred with his survival instincts for several long seconds before practical considerations won out. He banked the aircraft to the right, adjusting their heading to avoid the reported missile site. It was a small victory, but Elena felt a surge of satisfaction at having her tactical knowledge finally acknowledged. The aircraft climbed steadily away from Phoenix Base, gaining altitude and distance from the enemy forces that had been targeting them. Elena moved to one of the cargo bay windows and looked back at the base, which was now shrouded in smoke from the continuing mortar attack. The soldiers there were fighting for their lives, and the supplies they had delivered might make the difference between victory and defeat. But Elena's attention was quickly drawn to a more immediate problem. The fuel gauge readings that she could see from her position in the cargo bay were showing consumption rates that were significantly higher than normal. The aircraft had been running at high power settings during the extended takeoff sequence, and the additional maneuvering to avoid enemy fire was draining their fuel reserves more rapidly than planned. "Sir, we might have a fuel consumption issue," she called toward the cockpit. Coleman's voice crackled back with irritation. "Rodriguez, fuel management is not your responsibility." But Elena could see the numbers, and they were troubling. The mission had been planned with minimal fuel reserves, assuming a direct flight path and normal consumption rates. Their extended time on the ground at Phoenix, combined with the high-power takeoff and evasive maneuvering, had pushed their fuel usage well above projected levels. Thompson appeared at her shoulder, his experienced eye also drawn to the fuel readings. "How bad do you think it is?" Elena pulled out her calculator and began working through the numbers. Fuel consumption, distance remaining, wind conditions, and aircraft performance all factored into a complex equation that would determine whether they could reach Kandahar safely. "We're going to be cutting it close," she said quietly. "If we maintain current power settings and encounter any headwinds, we might not have enough fuel to reach base." Thompson's expression grew serious. "Should we recommend a fuel conservation profile?" Elena nodded, but she knew that approaching Coleman with another unsolicited suggestion would likely result in another dismissal. She had already pushed the boundaries of her authority by providing tactical intelligence and navigation advice. Additional input about fuel management might be seen as insubordination rather than helpful assistance. The decision was made for them by the sound of one of the engines beginning to run rough. The number 3 turboprop, which had been performing normally during their approach to Phoenix, was now showing signs of stress that suggested possible battle damage or mechanical failure. "Engine problem on number 3, Patterson reported, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone dealing with an in-flight emergency. Elena moved to a position where she could observe the engine through one of the cargo bay windows. The propeller was still turning, but she could see irregular exhaust patterns that suggested the engine was not producing full power. It was still functional, but its performance was degraded, which would further increase their fuel consumption as the remaining engines worked harder to maintain flight. Coleman's voice came over the intercom with the first signs of real concern. "All stations, we have a partial engine failure on number 3. We're going to reduce power and adjust our flight profile to conserve fuel." Elena felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that Coleman was finally acknowledging the severity of their situation, and apprehension about whether they could reach Kandahar safely with reduced engine power and higher fuel consumption. The aircraft's performance changed noticeably as Coleman reduced power settings. Their airspeed decreased, and their rate of climb diminished to almost nothing. They were now flying at the edge of their performance envelope, balancing the need to conserve fuel against the need to maintain sufficient altitude to clear the mountains between them and Kandahar. Elena returned to her fuel calculations, this time factoring in the reduced engine power and the lower airspeeds that would result from Coleman's conservation measures. The numbers were not encouraging, even with the most optimistic assumptions about wind conditions and fuel consumption. They were going to arrive at Kandahar with minimal reserves. "Sir," she called toward the cockpit, "recommend we request priority landing clearance at Kandahar. We're going to be at minimum fuel on arrival." Coleman's response showed the first signs of gratitude for her input. "Already requested, Rodriguez. Tower is standing by with emergency services." The flight toward Kandahar took on a different character as the crew settled into the rhythm of managing an aircraft in distress. Elena monitored the fuel readings and engine performance while Thompson checked and rechecked the cargo restraints to ensure that shifting weight wouldn't affect their flight characteristics. Patterson maintained constant communication with air traffic control, providing updates on their status and estimated arrival time. Elena found herself thinking about the irony of their situation. She was providing critical input about fuel management, engine performance, and navigation while officially serving as a cargo loadmaster. Her pilot training was proving invaluable, but she was still constrained by the rank and position that had been assigned to her after her training was interrupted. The aircraft droned on through the Afghan sky, its damaged engine producing occasional bursts of rough running that reminded everyone aboard of their precarious situation. Elena watched the fuel gauges with growing concern as the numbers continued to drop toward the minimum levels required for safe landing. "Sir, we're at bingo fuel," she called out as the gauges reached the critical threshold. "We need to begin our descent now if we want to have any reserves for landing." Coleman's voice came back with the tight control of someone managing multiple crises simultaneously. "Kandahar Tower, this is Cargo 77 declaring a fuel emergency. Requesting immediate vectors for approach." The response was immediate and professional. "Cargo 77, Kandahar Tower, you're cleared for immediate approach, runway 23. Emergency services are standing by." Elena felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as they began their descent toward Kandahar. The familiar landmarks of the airfield came into view, and she could see the emergency vehicles positioned along the runway in case their landing went badly. But they were going to make it, and the fuel emergency that had seemed so threatening an hour ago was now manageable. The landing was smooth despite the damaged engine, Coleman's skills proving adequate for the straightforward approach that Kandahar's long runway provided. Elena felt the aircraft touch down with the gentle contact that indicated proper speed and attitude, and she heard the reverse thrust engage as they began their rollout. "Nice landing, sir," Patterson said with genuine relief in his voice. Coleman's response was uncharacteristically humble. "Team effort. We all contributed to getting home safely." Elena felt a small surge of satisfaction at the acknowledgement, even though she knew it was likely to be forgotten once they were safely on the ground. The crisis had brought out the best in all of them, but military hierarchy had a way of reasserting itself once the immediate danger had passed. As they taxied toward the cargo ramp, Elena began preparing for the post-flight procedures that would officially end their mission. The aircraft would need to be inspected for battle damage, the engine problem would need to be investigated, and there would be paperwork documenting their emergency landing and fuel situation. But Elena was also thinking about the larger implications of what had happened. She had provided critical input during multiple phases of the flight, from the tactical intelligence that had helped them avoid enemy missiles to the fuel management that had gotten them home safely. Her pilot training had proven its worth, even though she was officially serving in a support role. The aircraft came to a stop at the parking area, and the engines wound down with their familiar whine. Elena began unbuckling her harness as the crew prepared to exit the aircraft, but she found herself looking forward to the mission debrief with an unusual sense of anticipation. For the first time in 18 months, she had been able to use her pilot training in a meaningful way. She had contributed to the mission's success in ways that went far beyond her official responsibilities, and she had done so under combat conditions that tested every aspect of her knowledge and training. The question now was whether anyone would recognize what had happened, or whether the military bureaucracy would continue to treat her as nothing more than a cargo loadmaster with ideas above her station. Elena had learned not to expect too much from the system that had already disappointed her once, but she couldn't help hoping that this mission might be different. As the crew filed out of the aircraft, Elena lingered for a moment to look back at the C-130 that had carried them safely through their ordeal. The aircraft showed signs of their adventure: bullet holes in the fuselage, scorch marks from the mortar explosions, and the irregular exhaust stains from the damaged engine. But it had performed flawlessly when it mattered most, responding to the crew's inputs with a reliability that made it one of the most trusted aircraft in the military inventory. Elena had always believed that aircraft reflected the capabilities of their crews, and today the C-130 had performed like an aircraft flown by skilled professionals who understood both its capabilities and its limitations. She had been part of that crew, even if her official role hadn't recognized her contributions. The mission debrief was scheduled for 1400 hours, giving the crew time to rest and prepare their accounts of what had happened. Elena spent the intervening time reviewing her notes and preparing to document the tactical intelligence she had provided, the fuel management calculations she had performed, and the navigation advice she had given during critical phases of the flight. She was careful to frame her contributions in terms of support rather than command, emphasizing her role in providing information rather than making decisions. But she was also determined to ensure that her input was properly documented, both for the official record and for any future discussions about her capabilities and qualifications. The debrief took place in the same conference room where they had received their morning briefing, but the atmosphere was entirely different. The casual confidence of the pre-mission briefing had been replaced by the focused intensity of professionals analyzing a complex and dangerous situation. Major Coleman began the session with a summary of the mission's key events, from the mortar attack at Phoenix Base to their emergency landing at Kandahar. His account was professional and complete, acknowledging the challenges they had faced and the decisions that had been made in response to changing circumstances. The mission was successful, Coleman concluded, but it highlighted several areas where our procedures and preparation could be improved. I want to hear from each crew member about their observations and recommendations. Patterson went first, describing the technical aspects of the engine failure and the fuel management challenges they had encountered. His account was accurate, but focused primarily on the mechanical issues rather than the human factors that had contributed to their success. Thompson followed with his assessment of the cargo handling and aircraft performance issues. His perspective was valuable because of his experience with C-130 operations, but his account was also limited to his area of expertise. When it was Elena's turn, she felt the familiar nervousness of speaking in front of senior officers about matters that touched on her interrupted pilot training. But she was also determined to provide a complete and honest account of her contributions to the mission. "Sir, I'd like to address several areas where I believe I was able to provide useful input," she began, her voice steady despite her internal tension. "First, the tactical intelligence regarding enemy positions and capabilities. I had studied the intelligence reports extensively during our pre-mission preparation, and I believe that information was helpful in avoiding enemy missile sites during our departure from Phoenix." Coleman nodded, his expression showing genuine interest rather than dismissal. "Continue." "Second, the fuel management calculations. I was able to monitor our consumption rates and provide early warning about our fuel situation, which I believe contributed to our successful emergency landing at Kandahar." Elena paused, knowing that her next comment would push the boundaries of her authority, but feeling compelled to address the most significant issue of the mission. "Finally, sir, I believe there may have been some opportunities to optimize our takeoff performance at Phoenix. The runway damage required a more aggressive approach than normal procedures would suggest, and I think we might have benefited from earlier rotation and higher power settings during the initial acceleration phase." The room fell silent as Elena's words hung in the air. She had just suggested that Coleman's flying technique had been inadequate, a criticism that went well beyond her official authority as a loadmaster. But she had also framed her comment in terms of future improvement rather than past failure, and her tone had been respectful rather than confrontational. Coleman looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Rodriguez, you seem to have a very detailed understanding of aircraft performance and flight operations. Where did you acquire this knowledge? Elena felt her pulse quicken. This was the question she had been dreading, but it was also the opening she had been hoping for. Sir, I completed most of the C-130 pilot training program before being reassigned to logistics. I have approximately 180 hours of flight training, including simulator time and actual aircraft operations. The room's atmosphere changed dramatically as the implications of Elena's statement sank in. She had just revealed that she was a qualified pilot who had been serving as a cargo loadmaster, a situation that raised questions about assignment procedures and the utilization of trained personnel. Why were you reassigned? Coleman asked, his voice showing genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. Elena chose her words carefully. Sir, there were administrative issues related to my training status that resulted in my reassignment pending resolution. The resolution process has been delayed, and I've been serving in my current capacity for approximately 18 months. Coleman exchanged glances with the other officers in the room, and Elena could see the wheels turning as they processed this information. A qualified pilot serving as a cargo loadmaster was an unusual situation that suggested either bureaucratic confusion or deliberate misassignment. Major Coleman, a voice said from the back of the room, I think we need to explore this situation more thoroughly. Elena turned to see Colonel Patricia Morrison, the base commander, entering the conference room. Morrison was a career officer with a reputation for directness and fairness, and her presence elevated the significance of the debriefing considerably. Colonel Morrison, Coleman said, rising to his feet along with the rest of the crew. I wasn't expecting you to attend the debrief. Morrison took a seat at the head of the table, her expression serious but not hostile. I received reports about your emergency landing and fuel situation, and I wanted to hear the details firsthand. But I'm also interested in Sergeant Rodriguez's background and qualifications. Elena felt the familiar mixture of hope and apprehension that came with senior officer attention. Morrison's presence could mean either recognition of her contributions or investigation of her unauthorized input during the mission. Sergeant Rodriguez, Morrison continued, I'd like you to explain your training background and how you came to be assigned to cargo operations. Elena took a deep breath and began to recount the story she had been reluctant to tell for 18 months. Her successful completion of most of the pilot training program, the administrative issues that had led to her reassignment, and the bureaucratic delays that had prevented her return to flight status. Morrison listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious as Elena's account continued. When Elena finished, Morrison was quiet for several long moments before speaking. Sergeant Rodriguez, you're telling me that you have nearly complete pilot training on this aircraft, and you've been serving as a cargo loadmaster for 18 months because of administrative issues? Yes, ma'am. I've been trying to resolve the situation through proper channels, but the process has been complicated by the classified nature of some of the training records. Morrison's expression hardened. Major Coleman, in your professional opinion, did Sergeant Rodriguez's input contribute to the success of today's mission? Coleman looked uncomfortable with the direct question, but his answer was honest. Yes. MAAM, her tactical intelligence, fuel management calculations, and navigation advice were all valuable contributions. I believe her input helped us avoid enemy missiles and manage our fuel emergency successfully. And her suggestions about takeoff performance? Coleman's discomfort increased, but he maintained his honesty. In retrospect, ma'am, I believe she was correct. A more aggressive approach to the damaged runway might have reduced our exposure to enemy fire and improved our overall performance. Morrison nodded, her expression showing the kind of controlled anger that senior officers reserve for bureaucratic failures. Sergeant Rodriguez, I want you to report to my office tomorrow morning at 0800 hours. Bring all of your training records, correspondence related to your reassignment, and any other documentation that might be relevant to resolving this situation. Elena felt her pulse quicken. "Yes, ma'am." Morrison stood, signaling the end of the debriefing. "Major Coleman, excellent work getting your crew home safely. The mission was successful, and your emergency management was professional and effective." As Morrison left the conference room, Elena found herself surrounded by her crewmates, all of whom seemed to be seeing her in a new light. The revelation of her pilot training had transformed her from a knowledgeable cargo loadmaster into a misplaced pilot, and the implications of that transformation were still sinking in. "Rodriguez," Coleman said quietly, "why didn't you tell me about your flight training before the mission?" Elena chose her words carefully. "Sir, I've learned that mentioning my pilot training often creates more problems than it solves. People tend to wonder why I'm not flying, and the explanations are complicated." Coleman nodded, understanding the political complexities that could surround personnel assignments. "For what it's worth, I think you would have made a good pilot. Your situational awareness and technical knowledge are excellent." Thompson clapped her on the shoulder. "Maybe you'll get another chance." Elena allowed herself a small smile. "Maybe." As the crew dispersed, Elena found herself alone in the conference room, contemplating the events of the day and their potential consequences. The mission had been successful, but it had also revealed the extent to which her talents were being wasted in her current assignment. Colonel Morrison's investigation could lead to her return to flight status, but it could also result in disciplinary action for exceeding her authority during the mission. The military had a complicated relationship with initiative and innovation, especially when it came from unexpected sources. Elena gathered her notes and prepared to leave the conference room, but she found herself looking forward to her meeting with Morrison with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. After 18 months of bureaucratic delays and administrative obstacles, she was finally going to have the opportunity to tell her story to someone with the authority to make changes. The question was whether Morrison would see her as a valuable asset who had been misplaced by bureaucratic error, or as a problem that needed to be managed and contained. Elena had learned not to expect too much from the military system, but she couldn't help hoping that this time might be different. As she walked across the base toward her quarters, Elena reflected on the day's events and their significance. She had proven her worth under combat conditions, contributed to the mission's success, and earned the respect of her crewmates. But she had also revealed the extent of her qualifications and raised questions about her current assignment that would need to be answered. Tomorrow's meeting with Colonel Morrison would determine whether her military career would continue on its current trajectory or take a dramatic turn toward the flight status she had been denied for 18 months. Elena had learned to be cautious about her expectations, but she couldn't help feeling that change was finally coming. The sun was setting over Kandahar Airfield as Elena reached her quarters, and she could see aircraft taking off and landing in the distance. Somewhere among those aircraft were pilots who had been given the opportunities that Elena had been denied, and she wondered if any of them would have performed better under the conditions they had faced at Phoenix Base. Elena knew that she would never know the answer to that question, but she was confident in her own performance and contributions. She had proven herself under combat conditions, and she had done so while serving in a position that underutilized her training and capabilities. Whatever happened in tomorrow's meeting with Colonel Morrison, Elena knew that she had finally demonstrated her worth as a pilot and a military professional. The rest would be determined by factors beyond her control, but she was ready for whatever came next. Elena knocked on Colonel Morrison's office door at exactly 0800 hours, her newly restored confidence evident in her posture and bearing. The flight suit felt natural again, like a second skin that had been missing for too long. Through the window, she could see the morning flight operations beginning, and for the first time in 18 months, she knew she would soon be part of them. Morrison opened the door with a smile that immediately told Elena the news was good. "Sergeant Rodriguez, congratulations." Major Walsh's evaluation report was glowing. She described your performance as exceptional and recommended you for immediate operational assignment. Elena felt warmth spread through her chest. Thank you, ma'am. I'm ready for whatever assignment you have. Morrison gestured for Elena to sit, then moved to a wall map of Afghanistan and surrounding regions. Your new assignment is with the 746th Expeditionary Airlift Squadron, but this isn't standard cargo operations. You'll be flying special missions that require pilots with exceptional skills and the ability to operate under extreme conditions. Elena studied the map, noting the remote locations marked with red pins. What kind of special missions, ma'am? Morrison traced a route through mountainous terrain marked with hostile activity indicators. Deep infiltration supply runs to forward special operations bases. These missions require flying in contested airspace, often at night, with minimal support and maximum risk. The pilots who fly these missions need technical excellence, sound judgment under pressure, and the ability to adapt to rapidly changing tactical situations. Elena felt her pulse quicken. These were the kind of missions that represented the pinnacle of military transport flying, requiring skills that few pilots possessed. Ma'am, why are you offering this assignment to me? Morrison turned from the map with a serious expression. Because your performance over the past 2 days has demonstrated exactly the qualities we need. Your tactical awareness during the Phoenix mission, your fuel management calculations, and your flight evaluation results all indicate that you're capable of operating at the highest levels of military aviation. Elena nodded slowly, understanding the magnitude of what was being offered. When would I start? Morrison consulted her calendar. Your first mission briefing is this afternoon. You'll be flying with Captain Maria Santos, one of our most experienced special operations pilots. She'll serve as your mentor during the transition to this type of flying. The name sent a jolt of recognition through Elena. Ma'am is Captain Santos related to the soldier we delivered medical supplies to at Phoenix? Morrison's expression softened slightly. Maria Santos is her older sister. When Maria heard about your role in saving her sister's life, she specifically requested to be your training partner. She said any pilot who would risk their career to save lives deserves the chance to fly at their full potential. Elena felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. The interconnectedness of their missions, the way one act of courage had led to this opportunity, seemed almost too meaningful to be coincidence. Morrison continued. There's something else you need to know. The investigation into your original reassignment has uncovered evidence of deliberate discrimination by Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. He's being relieved of command and will face disciplinary action. His actions cost the Air Force the services of a highly qualified pilot and violated both regulations and basic principles of fairness. Elena absorbed this information with mixed emotions. Vindication felt good, but it couldn't restore the 18 months she had lost or the opportunities that had been denied. Ma'am, what happens to the other pilots who might have been affected by similar discrimination? Morrison's expression grew determined. That's part of why your success is so important. You're not just getting your own career back on track. You're proving that talent and dedication matter more than prejudice and outdated assumptions. Other people are watching, and your performance will help open doors for them too. Elena understood the weight of responsibility that came with this opportunity. She wasn't just flying for herself. She was representing everyone who had been underestimated or marginalized because of their gender, background, or other factors beyond their control. Morrison handed Elena a thick folder containing mission briefings and operational procedures. Study these materials carefully. Special operations flying requires a different mindset than standard cargo operations. The missions are more dangerous. The margins for error are smaller, and the consequences of failure are more severe. Elena accepted the folder with reverence. I understand, ma'am. I won't let you down. Morrison extended her hand. I know you won't. Report to Captain Santos at 1400 hours for your first mission briefing. Welcome to the 746th, Lieutenant Rodriguez. Elena blinked in surprise. Lieutenant, ma'am. Morrison smiled broadly. Your promotion came through this morning. Effective immediately, your second Lieutenant Elena Rodriguez, qualified pilot with the 746th Expeditionary Airlift Squadron. Your back pay and benefits will be adjusted to reflect your proper rank and position. Elena felt the world shift around her as the magnitude of this transformation sank in. In less than 48 hours, she had gone from an underutilized cargo loadmaster to a commissioned officer assigned to elite special operations flying. The vindication was complete and overwhelming. Elena spent the morning studying the operational materials Morrison had provided. The missions flown by the 746th were unlike anything she had encountered during her original training. Night infiltrations into hostile territory, precision airdrops to special operations teams, medical evacuations from contested landing zones, and supply runs to bases so remote they appeared on no official maps. The aircraft they flew were specially modified C-130s equipped with advanced navigation systems, defensive countermeasures, and communications gear that allowed them to operate independently in the most dangerous environments. The pilots who flew these missions were among the elite of military aviation, selected for their technical skills, tactical judgment, and ability to remain calm under extreme pressure. Elena arrived at the 746th Operations Center 30 minutes early, wanting to familiarize herself with the environment before meeting Captain Santos. The facility buzzed with focused activity as crews prepared for missions that would launch after dark. The atmosphere was professional but relaxed, with the easy confidence of people who excelled at dangerous work. Captain Maria Santos was immediately recognizable from her family resemblance to the soldier Elena had helped save at Phoenix Base. She was slightly older than Elena, with the assured bearing of someone who had earned respect through demonstrated competence rather than rank or position. Lieutenant Rodriguez, Santos said with a warm smile, I've been looking forward to meeting you. My family owes you a debt we can never repay. Elena shook Santos's hand, feeling slightly overwhelmed by the gratitude in her voice. I was just doing my job, ma'am. Anyone would have done the same. Santos's expression grew serious. No, they wouldn't have. You risked your career to provide information that helped save my sister's life. That takes courage that goes beyond professional duty. Santos led Elena to a briefing room equipped with large displays showing satellite imagery and tactical overlays. Tonight's mission is a good introduction to special operations flying. We're delivering supplies to a forward operating base that's been cut off from ground resupply for 6 weeks. Elena studied the imagery, noting the mountainous terrain and the indicators showing enemy activity in the surrounding areas. What makes this different from standard cargo operations? Santos pointed to the landing zone, which appeared to be little more than a strip of dirt carved into a mountainside. The LZ is 4,200 feet long, surrounded by peaks that rise to 12,000 feet, and currently under intermittent enemy fire. We'll be flying in at night without lights, using night vision goggles and terrain-following radar. Elena felt her pulse quicken. This was flying at the edge of human and machine capabilities, requiring precision and skill that pushed every limit. What's our approach profile? Santos outlined a complex flight path that involved flying through mountain valleys below radar coverage, making multiple course changes to avoid known enemy positions, and executing a steep approach to the landing zone that would minimize their exposure to ground fire. The key to this type of flying, Santos explained, is staying ahead of the aircraft and the tactical situation. You need to be thinking 3 moves ahead at all times, because there's no margin for reactive decision-making. Elena nodded, absorbing the complexity of what they would be attempting. How do you prepare mentally for this kind of mission? Santos smiled. You trust your training, trust your equipment, and trust your crew. But most importantly, you remember why you're doing it. The people we're resupplying haven't seen fresh food or medical supplies in 6 weeks. Our mission might be the difference between their survival and their defeat. As evening approached, Elena joined Santos for the pre-flight preparation ritual that preceded every special operations mission. The process was more detailed and comprehensive than anything Elena had experienced, covering not just aircraft systems but tactical contingencies, enemy threat assessments, and emergency procedures, specific to operating in hostile territory. The modified C-130 they would be flying was a marvel of military engineering. In addition to the standard cargo capabilities, it featured infrared suppression systems to reduce its heat signature, chaff and flare dispensers to defeat incoming missiles, and advanced navigation equipment that allowed precision flying in complete darkness. Santos conducted the pre-flight inspection with meticulous attention to detail, explaining the modifications and their tactical applications. Every system on this aircraft is designed to help us survive in environments where standard aircraft can't operate, she said. But the most important safety equipment is between your ears. As they completed their preparations, Elena felt the familiar pre-flight excitement building. But this was different from the routine anticipation of standard cargo missions. This was the focused intensity of warriors preparing for battle, with the knowledge that their skills and judgment would be tested to their limits. The takeoff was conducted in complete darkness, with no external lights and minimal radio communication. Santos demonstrated the smooth efficiency of someone who had performed this routine hundreds of times, and Elena absorbed every nuance of her technique. As they climbed into the Afghan night sky, Elena felt a sense of purpose and belonging that had been missing from her life for 18 months. This was where she belonged, in the cockpit of an aircraft conducting missions that mattered, using her skills to make a difference in the lives of people who depended on their success. The flight to the forward operating base took 2 hours, following a route that avoided known enemy positions while staying below radar coverage. Santos demonstrated advanced flying techniques that Elena had never seen before, using terrain features to mask their approach and timing their movements to avoid detection. The key to survival in this environment, Santos explained as they navigated through a narrow mountain valley, is being unpredictable. We never fly the same route twice, never maintain the same altitude for long, and never give the enemy a chance to establish a pattern. Elena watched Santos work with admiration and growing confidence. This was the kind of flying that separated good pilots from great ones, requiring not just technical skill, but tactical awareness, strategic thinking, and the ability to make split-second decisions under pressure. The approach to the landing zone was unlike anything Elena had ever experienced. Santos descended through mountain peaks using night vision goggles and radar altimetry, threading the aircraft between obstacles that were invisible in the darkness. The landing zone appeared suddenly in their field of view, a short strip of dirt that looked impossibly small for their large aircraft. The landing was perfect, touching down at precisely the right spot with exactly the right speed. Santos applied reverse thrust and brakes with the precision of a master craftsman, bringing them to a stop well before the end of the runway. Outstanding, Elena breathed, genuinely impressed by the display of skill she had just witnessed. Santos smiled as she began the shutdown sequence. Wait until you try it. There's nothing quite like the feeling of executing a perfect approach in conditions that would challenge a simulator. The cargo unloading was conducted with military efficiency, but Elena noticed something different about this operation. The soldiers receiving the supplies looked at their aircraft with genuine gratitude, understanding that these deliveries represented their lifeline to survival. Their thanks were heartfelt and personal, making the risks and challenges of the mission feel worthwhile. As they prepared for departure, Elena realized that this was the kind of flying she had been meant to do. Not just transportation, but missions that made a real difference in the lives of people who were serving in the most dangerous environments imaginable. The return flight was conducted with the same precision and skill as their approach, but Elena felt a growing confidence in her ability to master these techniques. Santos began letting her handle more of the flying, providing guidance and instruction that helped Elena understand the nuances of special operations aviation. As they landed back at Kandahar, Elena felt transformed by the experience. This wasn't just a return to flying. It was an elevation to a level of aviation that represented the pinnacle of military transport operations. Santos shut down the engines and turned to Elena with a satisfied expression. How did that feel? Elena struggled to find words adequate to describe the experience. Like coming home, she said finally. Like this is what I was meant to be doing. Santos nodded knowingly. That's how I knew after my first special ops mission. This kind of flying gets into your blood and never leaves. As they completed the post-flight procedures, Elena reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. From underestimated cargo loadmaster to special operations pilot in less than a week, vindicated and restored to her proper place in the military hierarchy. 6 months later, Elena stood before a different aircraft, preparing for a mission that would have been unimaginable during her darkest days as a marginalized logistics coordinator. She was now the aircraft commander for her own crew, leading missions into the most dangerous areas of Afghanistan with the same skill and confidence that had characterized her mentor Santos. The transformation was complete, but Elena never forgot the lessons learned during her time in the wilderness. She made it her mission to identify and mentor other pilots who had been overlooked or underestimated, ensuring that talent would be recognized regardless of its source. Elena's story became legendary within the special operations community, proof that excellence could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, and that the military's greatest assets were sometimes hidden in plain sight. Her success opened doors for others who had been marginalized, and her example inspired a new generation of aviators who understood that barriers were meant to be overcome, not accepted. From the cockpit of her specially modified C-130, Elena looked out at the Afghan landscape and smiled. She had found her place in the world, earned through courage, skill, and the refusal to accept limitations imposed by others. The girl who had been told she would never fly cargo was now leading missions that redefined what was possible in military aviation. And she was just getting started. 2 years later, Captain Elena Rodriguez stood at the podium of the Air Force Academy's auditorium, looking out at 500 cadets who hung on her every word. The young faces before her reminded her of herself at their age, hungry for opportunity and determined to serve their country with distinction. But she also saw something in their eyes that she recognized from her own darkest days, uncertainty about whether they would be given a fair chance to prove themselves. The invitation to speak at the academy had come from General Patricia Shun, the first female superintendent in the institution's history. Shun had specifically requested that Elena address the graduating class about overcoming obstacles and the importance of recognizing talent regardless of its source. Excellence doesn't announce itself with fanfare, Elena told the cadets, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned every word through experience. It often arrives quietly, disguised as someone others have written off or overlooked. Your job as future leaders is to recognize that excellence wherever you find it. Elena's own transformation had been remarkable by any measure. After her success with the 746th Expeditionary Airlift Squadron, she had been selected for the Air Force's elite test pilot program. Her innovative approaches to extreme weather flying and high-risk cargo operations had revolutionized several aspects of military aviation doctrine. The research she had conducted on aircraft performance in combat conditions had been classified and adopted throughout the Air Force. Her techniques for fuel management in crisis, Situations were now taught at every transport pilot training facility. Most importantly, her success had opened pathways for other marginalized pilots who had been overlooked by the traditional system. Standing at the podium, Elena could see faces in the audience that represented the diversity she had fought to achieve. Women, minorities, and first-generation immigrants who might once have been excluded from aviation careers were now preparing to lead the next generation of military pilots. 3 years ago, I was a cargo loadmaster whose pilot training had been terminated for reasons that had nothing to do with my abilities, Elena continued. I was told I didn't belong in the cockpit, that I should be satisfied with supporting roles. But circumstances gave me the chance to prove that assessment wrong. Elena's story had become required reading at several military leadership schools, not just as an example of individual perseverance, but as a case study in how organizations could waste their most valuable assets through bias and outdated thinking. The Air Force had commissioned a comprehensive review of personnel assignment practices, leading to significant reforms in how talent was identified and developed. After her academy speech, Elena walked across the campus she had dreamed of attending. As a young woman, the cadets she passed now saluted her with genuine respect, knowing her reputation as both an exceptional pilot and an advocate for fairness in military aviation. General Chun joined Elena for lunch in the Academy's Officers Club, a tradition that honored distinguished speakers. Chun was a slight woman whose quiet demeanor masked the steel that had carried her to the Air Force's highest ranks. Captain Rodriguez, your presentation today was exactly what these cadets needed to hear, Chun said as they settled into a corner table overlooking the Colorado mountains. Your story represents the best of what military service can achieve when we get it right. Elena appreciated the recognition, but she was more interested in discussing the future than celebrating the past. General, I've been thinking about establishing a mentorship program for pilots who face barriers to advancement. Too many talented people are being lost because they don't have advocates who understand their potential. Chun's eyes lit up with interest. Tell me more about what you have in mind. Elena pulled out a folder containing the proposal she had been developing for months. A formal program that pairs experienced pilots with junior officers who show exceptional promise but face systemic obstacles. The mentors would provide career guidance, technical training, and most importantly, advocacy within the command structure. Chun reviewed the proposal with the attention of someone who understood both its importance and its challenges. This would require significant command support and cultural change. Are you prepared for the resistance you'll encounter? Elena smiled with the confidence of someone who had already overcome worse obstacles. General, I learned that resistance is often just fear of change dressed up as tradition. The pilots we develop through this program will prove their worth through performance, not politics. Chun closed the folder and extended her hand. You have my full support, Captain Rodriguez. I'll make sure this program gets the resources and command attention it deserves. 6 months later, Elena found herself back at Kandahar Airfield, but this time as the commander of a new special operations squadron tasked with the most dangerous missions in the theater. Her promotion to major had come with the opportunity to handpick her pilots and implement the training methods she had developed. The squadron Elena built was unlike any other in military aviation. Her pilots were selected based on ability and potential rather than traditional pedigree. She had former cargo pilots who had demonstrated exceptional tactical awareness, female aviators who had been underutilized in conventional units, and immigrant pilots whose unique perspectives enhanced the squadron's capabilities. The results spoke for themselves. Elena's squadron had the highest mission success rate in the theater, the lowest incident rate, and a reputation for achieving impossible objectives under the worst conditions. Their tactics and procedures were being studied and adopted by other units throughout the Air Force. Standing on the flight line as her pilots prepared for another mission, Elena felt the satisfaction of creating something that would outlast her own career. The young pilots she had mentored were now mentoring others, creating a culture of excellence and inclusion that was spreading throughout military aviation. Lieutenant Sarah Kim approached Elena with a mission briefing, her confident bearing, reflecting the opportunities that Elena's advocacy had helped create. Kim had been one of the first pilots selected for Elena's mentorship program, and her rapid advancement demonstrated the potential that had been waiting to be unlocked. Major Rodriguez, the weather forecast for tonight's mission shows challenging conditions, Kim reported. High winds, possible icing, and limited visibility. But the target zone desperately needs these medical supplies. Elena reviewed the briefing with the eye of someone who had flown in every conceivable condition. "What's your assessment, Lieutenant? Can we execute this mission safely?" Kim's response showed the kind of analytical thinking that Elena had worked to develop in all her pilots. "Yes, ma'am. The risks are manageable if we adjust our approach profile and use the advanced navigation systems. I've calculated alternate routes in case conditions deteriorate." Elena nodded approvingly. "Excellent preparation. You have my authorization to proceed." As Kim walked away to brief her crew, Elena reflected on how different this conversation would have been just a few years earlier. Then, a young female pilot's assessment might have been questioned or overruled by superiors who doubted her judgment. Now, competence was the only credential that mattered. Elena's phone buzzed with a message from Colonel Morrison, who had been promoted to Brigadier General and was now overseeing personnel development for the entire Air Force. The message was brief but exciting. "Elena, Pentagon wants to discuss your next assignment. Think bigger." Much bigger. Elena smiled as she deleted the message and turned her attention back to the evening's operations. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to meet them with the same determination that had carried her from marginalized cargo loadmaster to pioneering squadron commander. The sound of aircraft engines starting up filled the air as Elena's pilots prepared for their missions. Each takeoff represented not just a tactical objective, but a validation of the principles Elena had fought to establish. Excellence was colorblind and gender-neutral, requiring only the opportunity to prove itself. As the last aircraft disappeared into the Afghan night sky, Elena walked back to her office to prepare for her own mission the following day. On her desk lay letters from dozens of young pilots whose careers had been transformed by the programs she had created. Their success stories were Elena's greatest achievement, proof that changing systems could change lives. Elena had learned that the most important battles weren't always fought in the air, but in conference rooms and personnel offices where policies were made and careers were decided. Her victory hadn't just been personal. It had created opportunities for countless others who would follow in her path. The girl who had been told she would never fly cargo had become the woman who redefined what was possible in military aviation. But more importantly, she had ensured that future generations would be judged by their abilities rather than the limitations others tried to impose on them. Elena's legacy lived in every pilot she had mentored, every barrier she had broken, and every young aviator who now took for granted opportunities that she had fought to create. The sky was no longer the limit, it was just the beginning. From her office window, Elena could see the lights of aircraft returning from their missions, carrying their crews safely home after completing objectives that would have been impossible without the pilots she had trained and the culture she had built. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove that excellence knows no boundaries. Elena Rodriguez had found her place in history, not just as an exceptional pilot, but as a leader who had transformed military aviation for the better. The cargo she had truly delivered was hope, opportunity, and the promise that talent would always find a way to soar. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.